Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The flight that changed everything. Marcus James, a seasoned commercial airline captain, glanced out of the large airport window at the gleaming jet parked on the tarmac. Its polished body reflected the bustling activity around it, a microcosm of orchestrated chaos that Marcus knew so well. Today, however, he was not flying as the pilot. He was simply another passenger, dressed casually in jeans and a light grey button-down shirt, blending in with the crowd. His usual authority in the cockpit had been replaced with the quiet anonymity of travel, a rare opportunity to relax and observe from the passenger's perspective. Marcus had always loved flying, a passion that began when he was just a child. Born in a small southern town, he grew up watching airplanes streak across the sky, dreaming of the day he would be among the clouds. But dreams had not come easily for Marcus. His journey to becoming a pilot had been fraught with challenges, discrimination, financial hurdles, and an industry that often seemed unwilling to welcome someone who looked like him. Yet, he had persevered, earning his stripes through sheer grit and determination. Today, he was one of the most respected captains in his airline, admired by his colleagues and passengers alike. The journey from New York to Los Angeles promised to be uneventful, a chance for Marcus to relax, catch up on some reading, and enjoy the luxury of first class. He had chosen a window seat, tucked away from the hustle of the aisle. As he settled in, the soft leather of the seat cradled him, a stark contrast to the demanding, high-stress environment of the cockpit. For a moment, he allowed himself to sink into the comfort, pulling out a worn copy of his favorite aviation memoir. Passengers streamed in steadily, their voices blending into a low hum. Marcus noticed the curious glances occasionally cast in his direction. A black man in first class still drew attention, even in this day and age. Marcus had learned to shrug off such looks, his confidence unshaken by others' preconceptions. Yet, he couldn't ignore the familiar undercurrent of unease that came with those stares, a reminder that, despite his accomplishments, some people still saw him through a narrow lens. As the cabin filled, a young flight attendant approached, her blonde hair neatly tied back, her smile practiced yet polite. Her name tag read Claire, and she moved efficiently from passenger to passenger, ensuring everyone was settled. When she reached Marcus, her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for him to notice. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her voice measured and polite. "Could I see your boarding pass for a moment?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, but handed her the ticket without hesitation. He watched as her expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "Sir," she said after a pause, "it seems there's been a mistake with your seat assignment. This section is reserved for first-class passengers, and I'll need to ask you to move to economy." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Marcus stared at her, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my assigned seat. There's no mistake." Claire's smile tightened. "I understand, sir, but I believe this seat may have been assigned incorrectly. If you don't mind, I'll need you to move to the economy section." A ripple of silence spread through the cabin as nearby passengers turned to watch the exchange. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, their curiosity and discomfort palpable. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain composed. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. "I don't think you understand," Marcus said, keeping his tone measured. "This ticket was purchased and assigned to me. I am in the correct seat." Claire hesitated, her composure slipping slightly. "Sir, I assure you, this isn't personal. But this section is reserved for premium passengers, and we have procedures to follow." Marcus felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He had faced discrimination in countless subtle and overt forms throughout his life, but this moment stung in a way he hadn't expected. Here he was, a captain with thousands of hours of flight experience, being asked to move because someone couldn't reconcile his presence in first class. "May I speak to your supervisor?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Claire's cheeks flushed slightly. "I am the lead flight attendant on this flight, sir. I'm asking you politely to move." The cabin was silent now, the tension thick. Marcus felt a wave of emotions: anger, humiliation, and a deep, weary sense of resignation. But he also knew that this moment was bigger than him. How he responded would send a message, not just to Claire, but to everyone watching. "I'll move," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I want to have a word with the captain before we take off." Claire nodded, clearly relieved, and stepped aside as Marcus gathered his belongings. As he walked down the aisle to the economy section, he could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few openly judgmental. He kept his head high, refusing to let their stares diminish his dignity. Settling into his new seat, Marcus found himself reflecting on the countless moments like this one that had shaped his life. He had always believed in using adversity as a stepping stone, a chance to rise above and make a difference. This moment, he decided, would be no different. Unbeknownst to Claire, her actions had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the assumptions of everyone on board. Marcus wasn't just another passenger. He was a man who had dedicated his life to overcoming obstacles and breaking barriers. And by the time this flight landed in Los Angeles, he intended to ensure that everyone on this plane understood the power of resilience, dignity, and standing up for what was right. A seat at the table. Marcus sat in his cramped economy seat, his long legs pressed uncomfortably against the seat in front of him. The stark contrast between the spacious luxury he had just left behind and his current reality was more than just physical, it was symbolic. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, allowing himself a moment to absorb the situation. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about something deeper, an unspoken assumption that someone like him didn't belong in first class. The moment hung heavy in his mind, not because of anger, though there was plenty of that, but because of the familiarity of it all. Marcus had seen it time and time again. Assumptions, stereotypes, and snap judgments were hurdles he'd learned to leap over with grace, but today he had been blindsided by how brazen it was. As the plane continued to fill with passengers, Marcus watched the boarding process with the analytical eye of a pilot. He noted the efficiency of the crew, the way passengers juggled their luggage, and the quiet hum of the engines outside. His training had taught him to observe everything, to see the flight from a bird's-eye view, even as a passenger. It gave him comfort, in a way, knowing that he understood every mechanism of this aircraft, every procedure that ensured its smooth operation. Ironically, he probably knew more about the plane and its systems than the flight attendants working the cabin. A sharp voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is there a problem here?" It came from an older man standing in the aisle, dressed in a crisp navy blazer and khaki trousers. His graying hair was neatly combed back, and his watch glimmered with an understated elegance. He had the look of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, someone who never had to fight for his seat. Marcus glanced up to see Claire, the lead flight attendant, talking hurriedly with the man, clearly flustered. The man gestured toward Marcus, frowning deeply. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. "That's my seat. I'm not sitting in economy." Marcus felt his chest tighten. So this was why Claire had forced him to move. She had given up his first-class seat to appease another passenger. The injustice of it stung, but Marcus knew better than to let his emotions take control. Instead, he observed the interaction quietly, waiting to see how Claire would handle it. "Mr. Whitmore, please," Claire said, trying to keep her voice low and calm. "We've resolved the issue. I assure you, everything is in order now." But Mr. Whitmore wasn't interested in explanations. "In order?" he snapped, glaring at Marcus. "You kicked me out of first class for him." The venom in his tone was unmistakable. Marcus felt the eyes of the passengers on him once again, like a spotlight shining on his existence. Some expressions were curious, others sympathetic, and a few mirrored the disdain in Mr. Whitmore's words. It was a tension-filled tableau, and Marcus sat at the center of it. Claire tried to defuse the situation. "Please, Mr. Whitmore, let me handle this." "No," Marcus said, his voice clear and firm as he stood. "I'd like to handle it myself." The cabin went still as Marcus rose from his seat, his tall frame commanding attention. His tone wasn't angry. It was steady and resolute, the voice of a man who was used to leadership. The murmurs died down as passengers turned to watch the unfolding scene. Claire looked horrified, but Marcus kept his focus on Mr. Whitmore. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice even, "I'm sorry if you were inconvenienced, but let me clarify something for you. This is not your seat, it was my seat. I was asked to move for reasons I'm still trying to understand." Whitmore scoffed. "I don't care what seat you were assigned. I paid for first class, and that's where I'm going to sit." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unwavering. "And so did I, just like you. I earned my place in that cabin." Claire interjected nervously. "Captain," she stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized her mistake. The word captain seemed to reverberate through the cabin. The passengers' murmurings grew louder. Mr. Whitmore blinked, momentarily confused. "Captain," he repeated. Marcus nodded, stepping forward. "That's right," he said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "I'm Captain Marcus James, a senior pilot for this airline. When I'm not flying, I sometimes travel as a passenger, just like everyone else. Today, I purchased a first-class ticket, and for reasons I still don't understand, I was removed from my seat." The cabin fell completely silent. Claire paled, clearly realizing the full extent of her mistake. Mr. Whitmore, for all his bluster, suddenly looked embarrassed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Marcus turned to Claire. "I'd like to see the captain of this flight," he said. "Now." Claire nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir. I'll let them know." As she hurried toward the cockpit, Marcus sat back down in his economy seat. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, but Marcus was unfazed. He knew what was coming next, a conversation that would not only resolve the issue, but likely change the attitudes of everyone on board. 10 minutes later, Claire returned, her demeanor subdued. "Captain James," she said, addressing him formally now. "The captain would like to speak with you in the cockpit." The murmurs resumed as Marcus stood once more, grabbed his carry-on, and walked confidently toward the front of the plane. Passengers parted for him as he moved down the aisle, a path clearing before him as if by instinct. He felt their eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with admiration. When Marcus stepped into the cockpit, the current captain, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of command, greeted him warmly. "Marcus," she said with a slight smile, "I heard what happened. I'm so sorry you had to deal with that." "It's not your fault," Marcus replied, "but it needs to be addressed." The captain nodded, her expression serious. "Don't worry. I'll handle the crew and make sure this doesn't happen again." Marcus exhaled, feeling the weight begin to lift from his shoulders. He had spent years working to prove his worth in an industry that didn't always welcome people like him. Today had been a setback, but it was also an opportunity to remind people of something important. Dignity and respect were not privileges, they were rights. As Marcus exited the cockpit and walked back down the aisle, he held his head high. Claire stood at the front, clearly chastised, but Marcus offered her a small nod, a gesture of forgiveness and understanding. He knew that everyone on that plane had learned something that day. Prejudice could be subtle, but it was still dangerous, and it had no place anywhere, not even in the clouds. The lesson takes flight. Marcus walked down the narrow aisle of the plane with the calm, measured confidence of a man who knew his worth. The stunned silence of the passengers lingered like an echo behind him. For some, it was a moment of awe. For others, it was a realization of their assumptions being shattered. Marcus knew this wasn't just about reclaiming his first-class seat. It was about confronting the invisible barriers that still existed, even at 35,000 feet. He returned to the economy cabin for a moment, retrieving his carry-on bag and the dog-eared copy of The Right Stuff he had left behind. As he turned to head back to first class, a small voice stopped him. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus turned to find a young boy sitting a few rows back. He couldn't have been more than 10, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. Next to him, his mother looked apologetic, clearly uneasy about the earlier commotion. "Are you really a pilot?" the boy asked, his voice soft but hopeful. Marcus offered a smile that softened his otherwise stoic expression. "Yes, I am." "Wow," the boy whispered, his eyes lighting up. "That's so cool. I didn't know pilots could sit here too." Marcus chuckled, kneeling down slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "Sometimes we do, but most of the time we're up front, flying the plane." The boy grinned, clearly impressed. His mother relaxed slightly, offering Marcus a grateful smile. He nodded back in understanding. Moments like these were important, moments where a child's mind, still untainted by assumptions, could be filled with inspiration instead of limitation. "Maybe one day you'll fly planes too," Marcus said, handing the boy a small pair of pilot's wings he kept in his bag. The boy's face lit up as he clutched the token tightly. Marcus rose, feeling lighter as he made his way back to first class. Sometimes, all it took was one gesture, one word, to plant the seed of a dream. The return to first class. As Marcus settled back into his original seat, the atmosphere in first class had changed. The passengers who had previously been indifferent or judgmental now seemed unsure of themselves. Their whispers had faded, replaced by subtle glances and a newfound silence that bordered on reverence. The man who had questioned his presence, Mr. Whitmore, sat 2 rows ahead, his gaze firmly fixed on the window. His earlier bravado had disappeared, leaving behind only awkward stillness. The flight attendant, Claire, approached once again. This time, her demeanor was drastically different. The confident, dismissive edge had vanished, replaced with quiet humility. "Captain James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize, sincerely. My actions earlier were inappropriate, and I should have treated you with the respect you deserve." Marcus studied her carefully. She looked visibly shaken, as though the realization of her actions had finally sunk in. Marcus had encountered people like Claire before, people who acted out of unconscious bias rather than deliberate malice. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it also gave him an opportunity to teach, to leave her with something more than just shame. "Thank you for saying that," Marcus replied calmly. "But this isn't just about me, Claire. It's about how we treat people, how we judge them before we know their story." Claire nodded, blinking back tears as she tried to maintain her composure. "You're right," she said. "I'll do better, I promise." Marcus gave her a small, forgiving nod. "We all have room to do better." She placed a glass of water on his tray with a quiet, "Thank you, sir," before quickly stepping away. Marcus leaned back into his seat, watching the clouds pass by through the window. He wasn't angry anymore. Frustrated, perhaps, but not angry. This was the world as it still was, imperfect, flawed, but capable of change. The announcement that changed everything. A short while later, the pilot's voice crackled over the cabin speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon from the flight deck. We hope you're enjoying your flight today. This is Captain Rodriguez speaking, and I just wanted to take a moment to recognize someone very special on board. One of our senior captains, Captain Marcus James, is traveling with us today as a passenger." A ripple of surprise swept through the cabin. Heads turned, and passengers exchanged glances. Some of the first-class travelers stiffened in embarrassment, clearly piecing together the events that had unfolded earlier. Others looked at Marcus with newfound admiration. "Captain James has been with our airline for over 20 years, the voice continued. He's flown thousands of flights, ensuring the safety and comfort of countless passengers. It's an honor to have him on board today. Let's give him a quiet round of applause for his service." A smattering of applause began softly but quickly grew louder, spreading through both first class and economy. Marcus gave a polite nod in acknowledgement, though inwardly he felt a mixture of gratitude and humility. The recognition wasn't necessary, but it carried weight. It turned a moment of discomfort into one of validation, not just for him, but for anyone who had ever felt unseen or underestimated. The ripple effect. As the flight continued, the tension that had initially hung over the cabin slowly dissipated. Passengers seemed to go out of their way to interact with Marcus in small, subtle ways. An older woman sitting nearby leaned over. "Captain James," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm so sorry for what happened earlier. I hope you know most of us don't think that way." "Thank you," Marcus replied kindly. "I appreciate that." Moments like these, he realized, were where change truly began, not in grand speeches or headlines, but in quiet acknowledgements and small acts of understanding. A young woman across the aisle raised her voice just enough for Marcus to hear. "I'm so glad you stood your ground back there. My little brother wants to be a pilot. It's inspiring to see someone like you." Marcus turned toward her, offering a grateful smile. "Tell him to never stop dreaming. The skies belong to everyone." Her eyes brightened and she nodded eagerly. He knew those words would carry far beyond this flight. Even Mr. Whitmore, though still clearly uncomfortable, managed a curt nod in Marcus's direction as they landed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Landing with purpose. When the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the familiar thud of the landing gear hitting the runway grounded Marcus in the present. He waited patiently as passengers gathered their belongings, the hum of conversation filling the cabin once again. As Marcus stood to retrieve his carry-on, the little boy from earlier appeared in the aisle, clutching his mother's hand. "Bye, Captain James," he called out, waving the small pilot wings Marcus had given him. Marcus smiled warmly, waving back. "Safe travels, buddy." Walking through the jet bridge and into the terminal, Marcus carried more than just his luggage. He carried the weight of the moment, a moment that had tested his patience, but also offered a chance to teach, to inspire, and to shift perspectives. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing. And sometimes, all it took to spark that change was one man standing his ground, reminding others of the power of respect and dignity. As Marcus stepped into the busy terminal, his head held high, he knew one thing for sure. The flight may have landed, but the lesson was still soaring. A ripple becomes a wave. The cool Los Angeles air hit Marcus as he stepped out of the terminal and into the crowded arrivals area. The hum of activity was familiar. Taxi drivers shouting for passengers, family members embracing with laughter and tears, and wary travelers moving briskly toward their destinations. Marcus paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He had made it to his destination, but the events of the flight weighed heavily on him. "Captain James." A familiar voice called his name, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see a younger pilot jogging toward him. The man wore a crisp uniform and had the eager energy of someone early in his career. Marcus recognized him immediately, Nathan Kim, one of the junior pilots he had mentored over the past few years. "Nate," Marcus greeted him warmly as they shook hands. "What brings you here?" "I just landed," Nathan explained. "I heard about what happened on your flight." He hesitated, shifting nervously. "The crew's been buzzing about it. You okay?" Marcus studied the young man's face, noting the concern etched in his expression. For Marcus, moments like this were why he had pushed through years of struggle. Seeing young pilots like Nathan, full of ambition and ready to change the industry, made every challenge worth it. "I'm fine," Marcus assured him. "It was an experience, but it gave me an opportunity to remind people of something important." Nathan exhaled, relief washing over his face. "Captain Rodriguez told me about the announcement. She said the passengers applauded. That must have been something." Marcus smiled faintly. It was. But more importantly, it was a moment for people to rethink their assumptions, not just about me, but about what's possible. It's not about the applause. It's about planting a seed. Nathan nodded, a spark of understanding in his eyes. You know, sir, stories like this spread. You probably don't even realize how much you've inspired people, not just today but for years. You broke barriers for people like me. You don't just fly planes, you lift others up. The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. For years, he had kept his head down, focused on the work, focused on earning respect through action, not words. He had never stopped to consider the ripple effect his presence had on those coming up behind him. Nathan glanced at his watch. I have to grab my bags, but thank you, sir, for everything. As the young pilot hurried off, Marcus lingered, reflecting on the exchange. He had often wondered whether his efforts, his quiet resilience and insistence on pushing through adversity, had made any real difference. Today, he had seen the answer firsthand. The conversation that needed to happen. Later that evening, Marcus checked into his hotel, a familiar spot near Lax where airline crews often stayed overnight. The room was simple but comfortable, with a view of the city's skyline in the distance. He dropped his bag onto the chair and loosened his shirt collar, the weight of the day finally settling into his shoulders. His phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from the airline's chief flight attendant director, Lisa Monroe. Captain James, I heard about the incident on Flight 182. I would like to speak with you about your experience. Are you available for a call tomorrow? Marcus stared at the message for a moment before typing a short reply. Of course, thank you for reaching out. He had known a conversation like this would come. Claire's behavior hadn't just been an isolated incident, it was a symptom of deeper issues. While Marcus had seen progress in the airline industry over his decades of service, there were still moments, like today, that reminded him of how far there was to go. The next morning, Marcus sat in his hotel room, laptop open and ready for the video call with Lisa Monroe. Lisa appeared on the screen, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s with a short silver bob and sharp, observant eyes. She had been with the airline for over 30 years and had a reputation for being fair but firm. Good morning, Captain James, she said, her voice calm but serious. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. Good morning, Lisa. I appreciate you reaching out. Lisa got straight to the point. I received reports about what happened on your flight yesterday. First and foremost, let me say that I'm deeply sorry. What happened was unacceptable, and it reflects poorly on us as an airline. Marcus appreciated the apology, but he wasn't interested in platitudes. Thank you, Lisa. I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for change. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. I understand, and I want to hear your perspective. This isn't the first time I've heard concerns about unconscious bias among crew members, but it's rare for an incident to escalate the way it did on your flight. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but firm. Lisa, I don't think Claire acted maliciously. I think she acted out of ignorance of her own bias, perhaps, but ignorance nonetheless. This isn't just about her. It's about the culture that allows these assumptions to persist. Lisa sighed, clearly deep in thought. What do you propose, Captain? Marcus didn't hesitate. He had been preparing for this conversation for years, though he hadn't realized it until now. It starts with education. Your crew members need better training, not just on procedures and policies, but on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias. You have people like me, senior pilots, men and women who've broken barriers, who can share their stories and open people's eyes. Why not use us as resources? Lisa listened intently, her expression softening. You're right. It's time we took a stronger approach. I'll make sure this gets discussed at the leadership level. And one more thing, Marcus added. People need to see us. When I was a young pilot, I didn't have many role models who looked like me. Representation matters, whether it's in the cockpit, in first class, or at the highest levels of leadership. Lisa nodded again. You've given me a lot to think about, Captain. Thank you for your honesty and for your dedication to making this airline better. The power of stories. 2 weeks later, Marcus received an email from Lisa. Attached was a memo announcing a new initiative, diversity and inclusion workshops for all cabin crews, featuring real stories from pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff about their experiences overcoming barriers. At the bottom of the email was a personal note from Lisa. "Captain James, thank you for inspiring this change. Your story is already making a difference." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. He thought about the flight, about Claire, and about the young boy who had looked up at him with wide eyes. Each moment, big or small, had created ripples that were now turning into waves. The inspiration to dream. Months later, Marcus was preparing for a routine flight when he saw a familiar face in the crew lounge, Claire. She looked up nervously as he approached, but instead of avoiding him, she smiled. "Captain James," she said softly, "I wanted to thank you. I attended the first workshop last week. It really opened my eyes." Marcus nodded, his smile warm but knowing. "Good, that's what growth looks like." She looked at him with genuine gratitude. "And I'm proud to say I've encouraged my younger brother to apply for the airline's scholarship program. He wants to be a pilot." Marcus's smile widened. "Tell them to never stop dreaming. The sky belongs to all of us." As Claire walked away, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about moving forward, breaking barriers, and inspiring others to do the same. From that single flight, a story had unfolded that would continue to inspire others for years to come. And Marcus knew that the skies, once filled with obstacles, were now just a little more open. The skies belonged to everyone. Months had passed since the incident on Flight 182, and life had resumed its normal rhythm for Captain Marcus James. The skies, as always, remained his home, steady, vast, and free of borders. Yet, something within him had shifted. The experience that day had been a reminder of the battles he had fought to claim his place, but it also became a turning point for others, ripples that were spreading wider than he could have ever imagined. Now, as Marcus sat quietly in his small office on a rare day off, he reflected on the surprising ways his story had traveled. The airline's diversity and inclusion workshops had launched nationwide. Reports came back that crew members were having open, honest conversations, and unconscious bias was being addressed with real action. Pilots and cabin crew, once hesitant, were sharing their own experiences in ways that created deeper understanding. Change was happening, and Marcus could feel it. A soft chime from his computer pulled him from his thoughts. It was an email, and as he read the subject line, he felt a flicker of surprise. Keynote invitation, Annual Future Aviators Conference. An invitation to lead. The conference was being held at a prestigious aviation school, a place where dreams took flight for young aspiring pilots, engineers, and aircrew. Marcus had been invited as the keynote speaker to share his journey, not just the milestones, but the struggles that had shaped him. The email noted how his story, particularly the events on Flight 182, had resonated far beyond the airline. It had sparked conversations in classrooms, training rooms, and leadership meetings across industries. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. Public speaking had never been his forte. He had spent decades letting his work speak for itself, believing that actions mattered more than words. But this was different. This was about planting seeds, just like he had done for that young boy on the flight months ago. With a deep breath, Marcus typed his response. "I would be honored." The auditorium filled with dreams. The day of the conference arrived, and Marcus found himself standing backstage, listening to the quiet hum of the audience. The auditorium was filled with young aviators, eager faces staring up at the stage where their futures were being shaped. Flight instructors, airline executives, and parents filled the rows as well, their presence a symbol of both support and expectation. As Marcus stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He scanned the crowd, pausing briefly as his eyes caught a familiar face in the front row. It was Nathan Kim, the young pilot he had mentored. Nathan gave him an encouraging nod, a silent reminder that Marcus had inspired paths like his. Marcus adjusted the microphone, taking a steadying breath before he began. The story that needed telling. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "My name is Marcus James, and I've been a commercial airline pilot for over 20 years. But before I tell you about where I am today, I want to take you back to where I started." The room was still, every word hanging heavy in the air as Marcus recounted his childhood, his wide-eyed fascination with airplanes, his first glimpse of a pilot who looked nothing like him, and the moment he decided that he would be the one to break that barrier. He spoke about his years of struggle, the financial hardships, the rejection letters, and the times when people dismissed his dream before they even heard his voice. Then he paused, his tone deepening. "Several months ago, I boarded a flight not as a pilot, but as a passenger. I was dressed in jeans and a button-down shirt, looking like anyone else, but for one flight attendant, that wasn't enough. I was judged, not for my abilities, but for my appearance. I was told I didn't belong in the seat I'd earned, and for a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the battles I thought I'd left behind." The audience was quiet, their faces reflecting a mix of anger, sadness, and understanding. "But here's the important part," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "I didn't let that moment define me. Instead, I used it. That moment became a chance to teach, to challenge assumptions, and to remind everyone that the skies belong to all of us." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "The truth is, we all face moments like that. People will doubt you, underestimate you, and sometimes even try to stop you. But the only way they win is if you let them. Every time you face a challenge, remember that you have two choices. You can walk away, or you can use it to rise higher." The crowd sat in awe, captivated not just by his story, but by the sheer force of his presence. A man who had weathered storms yet stood tall, unshaken. The dreamers who take flight. After the speech, Marcus stepped down from the stage, greeted by thunderous applause that seemed to fill every corner of the room. People rose to their feet, clapping not just for his words, but for what he represented: resilience, dignity, and the power of possibility. Young students swarmed him after the event, asking questions and sharing their dreams. A young woman in her early 20s approached him last, her expression one of quiet determination. "Captain James," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm the first woman in my family to pursue aviation. I've been told I don't belong more times than I can count, but hearing your story, it gave me hope." Marcus smiled warmly, extending his hand. "You belong wherever your dreams take you. Remember that, and never let anyone tell you otherwise." A full circle moment. As Marcus left the auditorium, he noticed a small display outside, a wall lined with black and white photos of aviation pioneers. Men and women who had shaped the industry long before Marcus ever set foot in a cockpit. And there, among them, was a new addition, a photo of Marcus himself, accompanied by a plaque that read, "Captain Marcus James, breaking barriers, inspiring dreams." The sight caught him off guard. For a moment, the noise of the world faded, and he stood still, taking it in. This was more than just a tribute. It was proof that his struggles had not been in vain, that every challenge he had faced had created space for those who would follow. As he walked outside into the golden afternoon light, Marcus looked up at the sky. The same sky he had dreamed about as a boy, the same sky that now stretched endlessly before him. It belonged to him, just as it belonged to every person with the courage to chase their dreams. His phone buzzed again, a message from Nathan. "Captain James, I just got my upgrade to first officer. I wanted you to be the first to know. Thank you for everything." Marcus smiled, his heart full. He tucked the phone into his pocket and stepped forward, his silhouette framed against the open sky. The flight wasn't over, not for him, and not for the countless dreamers who would follow in his footsteps, because the skies, after all, belonged to everyone.